can we do anything to prevent some of this fervor that's harmful, this
Yeah.
divisiveness? As I was talking to another psychiatrist about it, I said, maybe we could stop cult leaders from emerging. And so they asked, well, what goes into a cult leader developing and being successful? Do we know enough about that to try to head off these cult leaders?
Hello, everybody. John Atack, you know me, and my great good friend, Dr. Stephen Moffic, also known as Dr. Jazz. Hi, Steve.
Hi, everybody out there.
So
I have a shirt that says jazz on it. I probably should have worn that, but
you should.
actually, John, I thought this shirt might mimic some of your artwork better. So that's
It's a beautiful shirt. What can I say? And thank you for the compliment.
well. Also, getting off track, but I don't know if I ever wore one of these to our interviews. But this shirt was made by a company led by Robert Graham. They're expensive. I get all these at thrift stores when I find them. But on the bottom,
Me
it
too.
said, it's embroidered, which I can't quite get up here,
Mm.
but it's embroidered knowledge, wisdom, truth. So I also thought, well, that
That's
fits
the shirt for the
all
me.
your work. Yeah. And that's so.
Excellent. Nothing beats a shirt motto, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm going to adopt his motto. So.
Mm. Yeah, let's go for that. So you said something about an editorial in the New York Times today, and people can look backwards. Today we're talking on the 5th of January, and wish everybody a happy New Year, of course, unless they're Chinese, in which case they'll have to wait. It's not even Christmas yet in Russia, you know.
Yeah.
Weird.
They're in the dark ages anyway. So
Gregorian and Julian calendars. They've probably got the date right, frankly. I think it was pulled back to the 25th because of Yule and Saturnalia and the pagan festivals. So January the 7th is probably right. So I'm going to have another Christmas.
okay.
My wife managed to actually go and have Christmas with part of her family. And then, so that was Christmas lunch. And then the poor woman had to come and have Christmas dinner with my part of the family. There are too many of us to put in one room. We're prolific. And so she had to eat two Christmas dinners. Imagine that. The things that women will suffer for us. It's incredible.
Sounds good to me.
Everybody seemed to be happy. So yeah, something about jazz in the New York Times, yeah?
Yeah, so I copied it just in case you were interested. So this is
Mm.
right on the front page of the online New York Times, right on the top.
Wow.
It says, I'm new to jazz. Where do I start? Uh, by David Renard. And then so David Renard lists some of the stuff that a young listener should listen to, classic stuff, Miles Davis, Kind of Blue, Stan Getz, some singers and so forth. And then people are starting to add in their own preferences in the columns. And,
Mm.
I think besides our own personal interest in jazz, to me, it has much wider ramifications. It's a form of music and activity that brings people together from different cultures and beliefs, and is all for freedom of mind, not mind control.
Yeah.
So that's part of why I love it. And so to see this is very heartwarming, to start the new year.
Mm. There is so much to be said. The Nazis banned jazz, um, and you'd be
Yeah.
sent to a camp if you were found listening to it. That was how bad it was. And I think
Soviet
it,
Union too. Soviet Union did the same
yeah,
thing.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And comedy, of course, in the Soviet Union, they sent their comedians to prison.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, that is the mark of a cult, a group that can't laugh,
Yeah.
other than spitefully at its enemies. A group that can't laugh and has no self-deprecation. It has to be. But jazz is improvisation, um, and that, there are elements of that. So if we think about mindfulness, and this plague that has fallen upon us of that if you stare at things for long enough, you'll become blissful, which I don't quite agree with, having stared at a lot of things for a long time. I do know what I'm talking about. But in jazz, you're expected to be in the moment. You're expected to improvise. You're expected to catch hold and work and then comp with other players so that you're pushing something forward. And I think that's very psychologically liberating.
Well, I mean, it's exactly what we're doing right now, and exactly like people do in real life when their mind isn't being controlled. You
Mm,
talk, you react, talk again, and interact, and go hopefully toward a place of warm and helpful conversation.
mm.
So yeah, jazz does the same thing. It just does it without words, which makes it a little harder, I think, for people. That's part of the reason I think it's not as popular, because it's not a simple form of music. So, but yeah, it mimics life, life at its best, potentially, I would say.
Yeah, and if turning back, I mean, I of course would start with Louis Armstrong if I was recommending jazz to anybody, because start at the beginning. Him and probably Sidney Bechet,
Yeah,
um, with whom I'm also deeply in love, and on through Ella and Lady Day and the Ellington Band, the Basie Band, and I mean, it was a very popular music from the breakthrough of the Benny Goodman Band in the mid '30s until rock and roll 20 years later came and drove it out.
yeah,
And
yeah. At that time, you could dance to it. In the past, I think that helped people stay interested. So, um,
I think it's a valuable point that and that jazz right from the start, you had novelty songs like Ella Fitzgerald Got a Pebble in My Shoe, which is or Tisket to Tasket. And they were novelty songs and they were thought of as pop songs by the people performing them. And then you had jazz, which was what you did in between. And gradually standards arose, a lot of them from American musicals.
yes,
Say Porgy and Bess, you've got the four standards in there straight away, starting with Summertime, the most recorded song in the world, recorded by more artists than any other song, I'm told.
yeah,
And of course, Gershwin didn't get to see that. It flopped on Broadway and then he died. So he didn't get to see this amazing success of this absolutely brilliant work. But those things become standards, and then you improvise over the top of the standards and keep working from there, and you get the very elaborate, incredibly difficult bop music of the 40s, Burt Parker and all of that lot, Dizzy Gillespie. And as you say, Miles Davis comes out of that, and then you get cool jazz, this jazz that you can sit down and listen to. But it is initially a lively dance music,
yeah,
and the jitterbugging was most popular.
yeah. And I think it reflects what's going on socially in the world too. I
Mm,
mean, probably my favorite kind of jazz ended up being what's called avant-garde jazz, and it was
mm,
when black musicians in the '60s started to develop a whole other form of music, which sounded more angry, I think appropriate so, but
yeah.
generally developed into a more, what should I say, a more beautiful kind of music. And I would take as the example for that John Coltrane's A Love Supreme,
Of
and
course.
which he based on his religious beliefs, but it was religious beliefs that he thought applied to everybody,
Mm,
even though he wrote the poem down about the music, and you could say it was Christian oriented, but not really. It was more ecumenical.
mm.
And so probably that would be the number one um, jazz song that I would pick. And it came out of this period of really angry music, but I loved it. And probably the one person I'd pick out of that would be Pharoah Sanders.
Mm.
Um, and each country, in the world, when there wasn't a repressive regime, had their own version of jazz, which shows how global it was. South Africa had their own jazz, which
Hugh
was
Masekela
really
and yeah.
theme song of ending apartheid was Dollar Brand, later
Mm,
called uh,
Abdullah Ibrahim.
Abdullah Ibrahim. Yeah, and so India has jazz. Israel nowadays, great source of jazz. Of course, England um, too, and just all over the world. So
Yeah, and you had the incredible renaissance of jazz through the ECM label in
mm,
Germany in the 70s and 80s, where Manfred Eicher just, and he went to Keith Jarrett and he said, I'm going to record everything you want to record. And so he started getting these improvisations that were 17 albums long because
yeah,
Eicher kept his promise. And Jan Garbarek came out of that band and got together with Eberhard Weber, and Oregon came in from the US. Pat Metheny launched on ECM. And
yeah,
something very new happened, and in fact, created something of a conflict when Ken Burns came to make his brilliant history of jazz, which sadly, I started watching it on the BBC here. I'm getting there's something wrong with this. And I found out they'd edited 6 hours of the 17 hours out, and the edits were not. So I waited until I could get the American version, then watched the whole 17 hours. It's brilliant. But then it gets to that point in the 60s where it's kind of going, and now jazz died because jazz rock is not a permissible form, among purists. And it was really strange seeing this kind of the way that jazz was originally dismissed as jungle music or something like this. Now we have these purists are saying, no, you're not allowed to go in this direction with it. I just last night I've been watching some things about Bill Connors, the guitar player, and he
mm,
made the first Return to Forever album with Chick Corea, Where Have I Known You Before, which is where I know him from because Corea, of course, was involved in Scientology. I'm sad to say Stanley Clarke has re-involved himself.
oh
But he made
really?
this one album and off he goes and he starts making these absolutely beautiful acoustic albums, which I had, which are on ECM and I knew nothing about them. It's 40 years since I first heard ECM stuff. And it just keeps on going that there are people of such creative brilliance. I mean, Aldo Meola, who was the guitar player who replaced him, he has done so much that is wonderful in the many years since.
Well, I was wondering what happened to Bill Connors. Actually, I loved him, and then he disappeared. So he disappeared into Scientology. Is what
No,
happened?
he didn't. He didn't. Stanley Clarke did, and
Yeah.
it may
So
well be
how about
the
Chick Corea?
Chick Corea died a Scientologist. Yes, having lost his entire
Yeah.
fortune along the way. Um,
Oh,
he had to sell the Mad
yeah.
Hatters
I thought over
studios. Yeah.
time his music got what much more simple. As time went on, I don't know if there was Scientology's influence or something else, but yeah,
I think for me, what happened was that his music became more glib. That
yeah,
because as a Scientologist, he was meant to be happy all the time and exhibit
yeah.
enthusiasm. There was, you need resolution. There you go. There's a John Coltrane track for us to all go and listen to. That so great music actually takes in all of the emotions and redeems and resolves them or not. I mean, we've seen a tremendous amount of what my friend Christian Churko calls Stockhausen syndrome in modern music, where it's understandable that people want to make these explorations, but we tend to have an emotional humor, each of us, that we tend to, I'm a fairly saturnine, I'm a fairly cheerful human being, but I can be melancholic. But I think we have a particular humor, and art forms dominate out of a particular type. So as jazz rose up during the Great Depression, so there's horror all around, and Buddy, can you spare me a dime? But jazz is this ebullient music that's saying, yeah, life is worth living, life's great. And at the same time, the serious music, and that is the technical term, I'm told, for what we generally call classical music, which is actually just a very short period with Haydn and Mozart. But what is called serious music became very serious. And after the Second World War, there's this line, it comes from a hymn, that only man is vile. My mother used to quote it at me, and I used to say, yeah, tigers eat their own young. It's not just us. Mosquitoes bite people. We're not the only vile things, but we're also capable of magnificence. Termites are pretty good at building, I'll give them that, but and they make beautiful things, but do they perceive them as beautiful? I think not. And so, going and listening to a Mahler symphony or, you know, playing a Love Supreme or what have you, we have this transcendent ability that this can give us. And that's been extinguished in the arts because if only man is vile, and if Auschwitz is the consequence of humanity, then it somehow seems sacrilegious for us to celebrate anything about life. And I think you got the same thing after the Black Death in the 1340s, which killed, they tell us, a third of the population of Europe. And all of the art afterwards has little skulls on it for 100 years and more. Memento mori, reminders of death. Oh yes, you're having a good time now, but let me tell you, And I do think that that simple spectrum is there in art, that you either want to revel in misery or you want to lift your spirits. And lifting your spirits is often taken to be somehow cheap or tawdry. Whereas in
It shouldn't
fact, it's the difficult
be.
part.
You know, jazz came out of racism, right? So if you didn't want blacks to develop more freedom in the United States, you repress their music, but that didn't work.
Yeah,
is their first way really of getting involved into the rest of society. It was a freeing music, generally on the positive side. And interesting enough, with classical music, basically blacks in America at least were excluded from participating in classical music, whether as a player or a composer, but not anymore. They're
no, no.
making great strides and they're changing the music to be more innovative, I would say. And there's an amazing family, I think in England, that
The
has
Ma
like
the Masons.
6 or 7 siblings
Yeah,
who all
yeah,
play classical music. I
yeah.
mean,
Shaka Kenya Mason is the cellist. We saw him um, year before last. But yeah,
oh wow.
he has a sister who's an incredible pianist, and yeah, they're all very clever, and they come from around here where I live.
Ah,
Though I haven't seen them on the street, I must say. But yeah, I mean, and just to put something in that I agree with you that jazz comes out of racism. If Ken Burns' hypothesis is right, it comes out of New Orleans because there are Creole mulatto musicians who have trained in the conservatoire and then find that under the Jim Crow rules, their performances are very restricted. And so they start, people like Jelly Roll Morton and Scott Joplin come along and start innovating and doing something else. But the other strand of that racism, when Louis Armstrong, when it was put to Armstrong in the late 20s, I think, that jazz is a black music, he said, what about Bix Beiderbecke? And it shouldn't have any limits as to who can play it, but there was a tremendous Jewish component in jazz. Artie
I was
Shaw,
just going
Benny
to get to
Goodman.
that. Yeah, I was just going to get to that. So I'm glad you
Mm,
brought it up. Yeah, it was there from pretty much the start. Benny Goodman's the most obvious one. Um, Jews also were able to run some of the recording labels.
mm.
Some controversy, why were they in control of the labels? But without them, there wouldn't have even been recordings of the development of jazz music for a long time. So, and Jews, of course, especially when we're talking about the 30s and 40s, were also subject to major anti-Semitism.
Absolutely.
So
And sadly still are.
yes, and which again makes it quite interesting to me how popular jazz has become in Israel. I think that's all connected to what we're talking about. It's a music of freedom, potentially joy, and Israel is probably producing the best jazz musicians around nowadays in the world.
Yeah.
So yeah, just just look at the Cohn family out of Israel, and there's a clarinetist named Annette Cohn who's just spectacular. She
Oh,
lives in the
wow.
United States now. Yeah.
I'll check that out. Yeah, I mean, we saw jazz in France, obviously, the Hot Club of Paris Django Reinhardt, Stefan Grappelli. You can't fight with that. Neither of them was actually French, but we won't get into that. And again, a persecuted minority, gypsies, Romani, Roma.
Yeah,
Um,
very interesting with France too, going back to avant-garde music
mm,
by Black musicians. So Russ and I were married in 1968. It was the same time that the best avant-garde musicians, Black musicians, called the Art Ensemble of Chicago, went to Paris, welcomed there,
mm.
and some of their best records were produced. I think it was on an actual label, but France was so welcoming to Black jazz musicians before then and after then, for that matter. Yeah,
Yeah, in the 30s, both Ellington and Louis Armstrong, when they arrived at Paris airport, were met by a line of French composers.
yeah.
And of course, from quite early on, Delius is the first I know of in the 1880s, listening to black singers in the evening on the orange plantations in Florida, and that was what made him want to be a composer. And he then went to the conservatoire. Then Debussy and Ravel, and of course, famously Shostakovich, even
Dvorak,
Stravinsky
Dvorak.
and Dvorak. They all pick up, and in Mahler, you can still, who dies in 1911, but you can still feel his understanding of the blue note and the use of the blue note is consummate.
Well, even more than that, there's a great example of him. And Mahler was, of course, Jewish first, and converted. But his first symphony, and I think it's the first movement, has this wonderful klezmer
Klezmer.
action,
Oh yeah.
very uplifting and atypical after that for Mahler. But
Mm.
it was there right in his first symphony.
And he will return to it. I mean, there's a story about him that when he was 6 years old, he stood up in synagogue while Sarah the cantor was singing and said, "That's not music," and started whistling a klezmer tune in synagogue. So, as you say, he did convert, but he only went to church once. He converted to Catholicism so he could get married, but he didn't go to church again.
Yeah.
And for me, his music is the demonstration of religion, of the sacred, of the spiritual. Definitely big on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think people we so easily undervalue the effect of culture. I'm working on a piece. Who knows if I'll finish it, called "The Cult in Culture," because of course the two words and cultivation, they all come from cultus, which means to worship. um, and so our culture is cultic. Our culture, very much. I mean, I can get into elaborate detail, but in the field of painting, and to keep it as simple as I can, Pete Mondrian dominated abstract painting. Abstract painting, and I'm an abstract painter. I don't seek to make paintings that look like anything, and my paintings don't derive. They're not copies of objects in any way. I mean, it's a simplistic comparison and it's wrong, but it's easy. That if you thought that all your musical instruments impersonated the sounds of nature, and that's what they did. So they'd be ducks and geese and dogs and that have you. And so
The
music would
voice.
represent nature. It would be representational. Now, if you flip that over and look at painting is doing that. It's representing nature, and that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. But what about pure music? What about music that doesn't sound like ducks in the barnyard? Is there some other way to go? And that way to go was stopped by the theory of non-objective painting, which starts with Pete Mondrian. And he's saying, well, you mustn't have any skill to be able to do this, and it mustn't look like an object. It's against the rules for it to look like an object. And I go the other way and say, if it looks like an object to you, that's fine by me. I'm interested in space, in movement, in color, in all of the things that painters, I think, should be interested in. It's all closed down.
But
Interestingly, Mondrian was a cult member. He was a member of a theosophical subgroup called Neoplasticism under a man called Schoenmakers, and the doctrine comes from him. It's nothing to
so
do with
that,
aesthetics.
but didn't he also title some of his paintings abstract out of jazz music, boogie woogie? And when he talked about his works, said they were representatives of that form, particularly of jazz.
Yeah,
So he had in mind something that wasn't abstract,
yeah.
but
What he would have thought of as jazz was the Black Bottom, the very early 20s Dixieland, Broadway Boogie Woogie, which is the work you're thinking about, and he never finished it. The little tapes he put on it are peeling off now. And
oh,
he is interested in music as a kind of mathematical construction, which of course Bach was. You know, you can see how that can be done, but it works very beautifully for Bach. But he would dress up in a suit and dance around like this while he was painting. We're not thinking about cool jazz. We're not thinking about anything beyond very simple dance music. And this was incorporated within the cultic beliefs that he had, which are very, very wacky. Theosophy, as I think my recent book has shown, is very, very wacky. And it's the idea that his work is serious, therefore his ideas are serious, therefore we'd better do what he says. And you start having a culture that's dictated by what you're meant to do. We saw some of that in the 80s when hard bop came along, and there started to be a kind of racist inversion where there'd be black bands and you weren't allowed to be in the band if you weren't black. And this was music that was black. And it started becoming a didactic and very cold form and didn't last very long. Neo-traditionalism blossomed out of it and we're all very happy with what Cassandra Wilson did later. But it culture can be used to restrict. It can be
well,
used to inhibit freedom of mind.
yeah, yeah, you again, you're probably anticipating what I'm thinking about. Now, I'm the psychiatrist here, so
Yeah,
stop.
sorry.
But
Yes,
what
but
was
I'm the
funny,
one with the spiritual powers.
so what I was thinking about is, at least in the United States, culture, the word culture is used in two different ways. One is about the arts, which we've just been talking
Oh,
about. And what you were turning to is our use of culture in the United States, the word for ethnic groups. Very much,
cultures. Yeah.
yeah, culture, very much different. And I think that often confuses people um and I don't know if that sort of helps either side. I don't know if thinking about like classical music as high culture, which is common in the United States, um, or excluding people from ethnic cultures, which led really to this whole woke movement, that only people from a certain ethnic culture could do certain things. Otherwise, you're robbing their culture in the artistic sense. So,
Yeah, only Mexicans should be allowed to use chilies
mhm.
or potatoes or tomatoes or peppers. You know, Indians should not be practicing the cultural, um, what's it, appropriation of making curry, which is an English word, by the way, not an Indian word. I mean, it's all, we should separate everything out. There's a brilliant British comedian who went through a set of, he started with one of these kind of right-wing political groups, and this guy had said that um, the Romanian who was serving coffee in his coffee shop should go back to Romania, so that the best and brightest should stay in Romania. And Stuart Lee, the comedian, took this back to the beaker people, and he said, "We don't want beakers. We can drink out of our hands." You know that. And there's a great book, Josephine Quinn, How the World Made the West. She's a professor of antique history, ancient history at Cambridge. And she said this nonsense, this idea that you get this culture like Egypt, Crete, Greece, Rome, civilization. You look at the Romans and the Greeks and you go, oh no, genocidal, brutal slaveholders, not interested in that. And she shows how how aspects of culture continue to change and be absorbed. The importance of the Phoenician culture, for example, which is forgotten in that time. The importance of Judea, that each place, you know, and we've completely forgotten the Persians. Who cares about them? That everywhere has given something, and these things are constantly. So the idea of cultural appropriation, what does that mean? Should the Japanese be allowed to use silk? Because it's a Chinese thing, isn't it? But is it a thing from just one part of China? Should just the people on this street be allowed to use it? It's like a very close friend of mine was criticizing the musician John Martin, whose work I absolutely love. His album Solidaire is one of the great things. Danny Thompson's double bass playing is just euphoric on that. But he criticized him because he's using an Echoplex Echo on his guitar. And he said, but his wife did that before him. His wife Beverly did it before him. And I'm kind of going, now the same person said to me that Paul Simon's Rhythm of the Saints, Joni Mitchell had already done that because she'd use, I think actually they might be African drummers rather than Brazilian drummers. But it's this thought that it's got to be novel. So no, the guitar's been played before. You need a new instrument. It's kind of, where do we put the limits to this? And is it all right for Delta bluesmen to be playing Spanish guitars? The word Spanish is a bit of a clue there. This, yeah, the extremes of woke, which I don't agree with Elon Musk that it's a virus, and I'm also writing a piece about how stupid I think our use of the word virus for anything we don't like. Oh, they've got a mind virus, religion's a virus, atheism's a virus, everything's a virus. No, it isn't. Viruses mutate at every generation. It's exactly the opposite of what you're thinking about. It's not something imposed on you that will remain, a meme or what have you. But we get caught up in all of that, and there's a little rule book about what we're allowed to say. I mean, I, as a child, learned to imitate accents, and I just did it naturally. So I would do a Scottish accent with no problem whatsoever. But, and, German, French, whatever you like. Australian, nah problem. Uh, and then I got to the point in my 30s where it became politically insensitive to impersonate accents. And I'm going, oh, but I'm not doing because I dislike these people. I'm not punching down. I'm actually quite delighted by the different inflections of speech, and I don't think that any one of them is paramount and superior. When we're watching The Wire, I persuaded my wife that she really got to watch it, and it's about my fifth time through it, and the Be More accent and the way that things are expressed in there is beautiful. It's a jargon, an idiom, or what have you. It's beautiful to me. But if I start doing it and using some of the words they use, one of which begins with N and is frequently used, then I'm somehow doing something that's evil and wrong. I'm somehow judged.
No, at its best, we're talking about admiration, not appropriation.
Exactly, yeah.
And the metaphor I try to use about all this, on the one hand, the United States is said to be a melting pot, which I don't think is true, but that's the metaphor that's used. And then you have the most extreme woke stuff where cultural groups stay separate and should be separate. But I like to use a food metaphor, the potluck meal, that people from different cultures bring the best of their culture and food to the table. People, if they trust eating food that is strange, eat it, like it, and start being more positive toward other groups and foods that are strange. I think that kind of model actually works the best to bring people together and keep their separation at the same time.
Absolutely, and it's really interesting in the US. One of the things I'm very interested in is the history of education, and the longest running educational system, unless we start looking to the San of the Kalahari, who've been doing it for a long time. But let's put that aside, and they're brilliant. Their educational methods are brilliant. But in the way we think of schools, it's the Prussians that after they were beaten at the Battle of Jena or Jena by Napoleon, they were really upset. How come he could beat us? So they started schools. So the idea was that they were going to make soldiers. And that was in 1805 or something. It's quite early on. and it's one of the brilliant von Humboldt brothers, two of the most influential people in the history of humanity, Alexander and Wilhelm von Humboldt. But so they start a school system that persists to this day. After them, when you look at the different systems in the UK, in Great Britain, the schools existed. Universal education came in what, the 1870s, with the idea of at the one level training colonial servants who could run the Raj and the empire, and at the other level, more importantly, putting the children somewhere so the women could work in the factories. Now, these are real reasons. In the US in the 1880s, when universal education hits, and Massachusetts tried to resist it, and they've never gone back to the literacy level they had when universal education was introduced, which is a fascinating idea. They have very high literacy. I mean, anybody who can spell Massachusetts must have high literacy. Let's face it. But the idea was to homogenize the population, to get past the divisions in the population. And you look at one place in the world where everybody's labeled. They are African American, Italian American, Somalian American. They're all hyphenated. In this country, it doesn't matter where you come from, and it doesn't matter what color your skin is. If you're born here, you're English. You're not Indian English or Caribbean English. Those are not natural expressions to us. And so that division that happens, and of course it is right to continue our culture, but when it becomes then a matter of, we're with the Nation of Islam and we want a black state, or we're with the Ku Klux Klan and we want a white state, and that ridiculous idea that our ancestors were all black. Let's accept it. Our ancestors were all black. Genetics has long since demonstrated that. We're just some of us paler than the rest.
Yeah, yeah, that's so interesting what you just said about England, because one of the topics I taught for 40 or 50 years in psychiatry is cultural psychiatry.
Mm-hmm.
And we start with presenting our own identifications culturally. So I asked the residents, and if there's any other faculty there, how would you describe yourself culturally?
Mm-hmm.
And what they do is just what you said: Italian American, Jewish American, Black American, hardly ever pure American, hardly ever Earthling, which is my favorite.
Mm-hmm.
And
Or
so
groundling, as Shakespeare had it for us peasants.
yeah, so so I usually ask them, why did you choose this? What about your gender? What about your religion? So what's the important way of identifying yourself, and how are you going to find that out with patients? And so to hear that in England, probably we wouldn't get those sorts of answers. Now, I don't know if that means you're any less prejudiced in the treatment of minority groups, because the underlying issue for why I do that is certain cultural groups don't get treated as well in psychiatry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Background. So I want the residents, the future psychiatrists, to be sensitive to that and know how to overcome that and get trusted by their patients who aren't the same as them. So it's a very interesting difference you brought up.
And the division continues, and there is still racism, and we have a populist movement called Reform, who, if there was an election tomorrow, would probably win governance of the country. As it is, we've got another 4 years before there's an election, and hopefully they will have besmirched themselves so horribly by then. But this is the group that Elon Musk offered to give $100 million to. And to put that in perspective, that's about £80 million. That's about 4 times what our biggest political party spent on its whole campaign. He also wanted a serially convicted offender who has renamed himself Tommy Robinson. That's not his actual name. He wanted him to become party leader. And so we do have racism, and we do have people who still labor under the misapprehension that there are different types of human being. Whereas in fact, and again, my last book is very much about that. It has a whole section on eugenics. It has a whole section on genetics. hopefully in understandable terms. It took me a while to understand it.
Okay.
So, when the thing that the Nazis did prove that nobody seems to have said, I think I'm original in saying it, they disproved the Aryan race theory thoroughly. They measured hundreds of thousands of people, and in the end, they couldn't tell the differences other than through the very simple ways. And in one of their surveys, 11% of the Jews that they checked had blonde hair and blue eyes. And it got to be that simple. It's just a fairy story. The whole idea of the division between peoples, as you say, we're all humans, we're all
Well,
cousins, we're all related.
what I was curious about in that regard is how Muslims in England identify themselves. So if you ask them, how would you identify yourself culturally or whatever,
Mm.
what would they say? Because the religion part seems to be so important, and how Muslims are accepted in England, I guess, has some controversy to it,
Mm.
or some conflict. So how would they identify themselves? Do you think, or maybe
I think Muslims do tend to identify by their religion. Um, in times where religion is really in Europe is falling apart. I mean, Israel is the precursor. It's reckoned that 40% of Israelis are atheists.
Oh
About
yeah,
5% of Americans, Northern Americans, and probably 10 or 15%. But in terms of people who belong to congregations and go along with it, we see we don't have the fervent evangelicals in this country in the great number that you do in the United States. So I think it depends on, and I think that because of Islamophobia, because of to me, I've spent years. I studied terrorism as an essential subject in the 1990s. So before 9/11, I was already looking at how people were radicalized into groups. And we had Richard Dawkins coming along and saying, well, all of this suicide bombing, it's all because of religion. Now, when he said that in, I think, 1999, it was still measurable. There had been about 900 suicide bombings. Half of them were secular. The Tamil Tigers, for
yeah.
example, or the Al-Aqsa brigades in Palestine. They're not religious per se.
Right.
So he got this religious bug going on. People start getting this idea that all Muslims are there for this because they don't realize that the Muslim Ummah, the congregation of the Muslims, is as diverse as that of Christians. And if you put a Russian Orthodox, a Lutheran, an Anglican, and a Catholic in the room, you've got 9 different points of view. It's like, any two rabbis, you've got 3 points of view. And as you know, as it is within Judaism, that you have the Haredi, the ultra Orthodox so-called, through to Reform, conservative, all sorts of different persuasions. Well, the same for Muslims. You have the major split between the Sunni and the followers of the Shiat Ali, the Shiites. Then within those, you have Seveners and Twelvers within the Shiat Ali. Then you have the many different Sufi groups within the Sunni. And I think if they trusted that you were not going to be unpleasant to them, that probably most Muslims would say, I'm a Muslim. That's important to me. And of course, about 0.5% of the entire Muslim population of the world, and the largest part of that population, of course, is down in Indonesia, not in the Arab states or Pakistan. But about 0.5% of Muslims belong to the Wahhabi or Salafi sects out of Saudi Arabia, which gave us Al Qaeda and Daesh. I mean, there are Shiite groups as well, but they are not a coherent body. And most Muslims, as with most Christians, you can look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, and you can find Jesus saying that he's come to bring a sword, he's come to separate the wheat from the chaff, he's come to separate father and son, these kind of things. He also says, if your right eye offends you, pull it out, pluck it out. And I'm kind of going, well, I haven't seen anybody doing that. How much of this is literal? How much is there a metaphor? and it depends on the person interpreting the religion. And in my experience, and I know many practicing religionists, include several among my closest friends, whereas I am an agnostic. But they interpret what is being said towards the benefit of humanity. And in my experience of Muslims, that's true of Muslims too. Though I think what's been happening in the Middle East since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1918 has been devastating for those populations,
Yeah,
largely because of the British and the French occupations and then what the Americans did after that. But
yeah, and maybe that helps account for the distinction you made. I mean, I found it really interesting that you would say earlier that most people in England would identify themselves as English, but maybe Muslims would identify themselves as Muslims, not as English.
or as
And that's
English Muslims, as English Muslims. Yeah.
yeah, but sort of still separate. And you've been involved with our books about different religions and psychiatry, and I guess to get a plug in advance, we've got a second edition of Islamophobia and
Rush
Psychiatry.
out and buy it. Rush out and buy it.
Yeah, coming out
You
in the
can't live
next.
without this book. It's fantastic. It'll clean your shoes. It'll make you a cup of tea in the morning.
The strange thing about this is that the publishing company asked for this second edition. And why did they ask for a second edition? Because of the war that came out of October 20, except October 7th, 2023, the invasion by Hamas. So they said, would you do a second edition? Because things are obviously going to be volatile. I was personally reluctant to do so because it puts me as a Jew in a precarious position of being the final arbiter of what goes into this book.
Yeah.
But to my surprise, the whole process was smoother among all of us from a religious and ethnic side than the first edition.
Yeah.
Somehow we've made progress in being able to work together smoothly and more easily. So nothing else, that's been a really positive aspect of working on this. And it obviously goes about beyond, well, to have a book about Islamophobia and psychiatry, you have to have a Muslim as the lead editor. No, you don't. I'll confidently say that. So
You're one of the few
the
people in the
same
world who
about,
can confidently say that, really. There probably
well,
aren't
I
that
don't
many
know
Jews
about
who
that,
have
but
edited books about Islam.
exactly. And the same the other way around. I mean, imagine now, could there be a Muslim who could be the lead editor about a book about anti-Semitism and psychiatry? Well, maybe. I mean, I could think of at least one offhand, but to just exclude that can't be done. You can't have this support and interest and curiosity from somebody who's not of a particular religion or culture, to me is absurd and
Yeah.
it's destructive. So yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think there is the feeling that if somebody believes in a religion, they are a fanatic. If somebody believes in a religion, that they will do all of the worst things.
That
So
too,
if you're
especially with
Jewish, you'll read the book of Joshua and go and murder as many Canaanites as you can get your trumpets on. And it's not reality, and it's never been reality. We each of us interpret the world through our own
differently.
eyes and our own perception, and some of us have volatile temperaments, and some of us don't.
Right.
Just my dear Israeli American friend Yuval Law, with his work on fervor, which I think is vitally important in our day and age, understanding why some people are so fervent that they will kill other people who they do not know, who have done them no harm. That baffling position, which is about belief, and sometimes that belief is religion.
Yeah.
But I think I've been asked to look at a survey that Roehampton University are doing about mandatory shunning, and they've largely had responses from members of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, which is people who are usually called Jehovah's Witnesses. And in their survey, they've used the word religion. And I'm kind of going, but most of the groups that we would look at, the thousands of groups that we would look at as dangerous cult groups, are not religious. You know,
Yeah.
so you've got groups like the Forum Landmark Trust. That's one, the one Earhart groups, Tony Robbins, LifeSpring. But you've then got multi-level marketing, which uses the same psychology. Quick plug, my book Opening Our Minds gets into these parallels that run through advertising, through public relations, that have been used by the CIA, that have been used, of course, the greatest experts of propaganda going right back to the 19th century are the Russians. It was the Cheka who gave us the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, for example, which was used by Henry Ford.
Hmm.
Was well, he had the fourth biggest selling newspaper in the US, the Dearborn, was it Dearborn Advertiser or something, Dearborn something, Chronicle, what have you. And through that, he reprinted this completely, absolutely, utterly fraudulent nonsense, which the original of which has been traced back. There were court cases fought over it in Switzerland in the last century before the Nazis came to power, showing it was a fake. But it was created by the Russian Cheka. And as a piece of propaganda, very little beats it. And of course, they're still quite good at it. But to see that, therefore, you have cults being created, you have these anti-human groups, these anti-social groups that are being deliberately fostered, some of them by intelligence agencies like the Order of the Solar Temple, for example.
Well, I'll ask you a question about cult leaders because it was asked me and I wasn't sure how
Hmm.
to answer it actually. Because one of the things I'm interested in, can we do anything to prevent some of this fervor that's harmful, this
Yeah.
divisiveness? As I was talking to another psychiatrist about it, I said, well, you could, maybe we could stop cult leaders from emerging. And so they asked, well, what goes into a cult leader developing and being successful? Do we know enough about that to try to head off these cult leaders?
I
And I
think we
said,
do.
I'm not sure. So I'll ask somebody who knows more than me, which is you. So,
Absolutely. I spent the last 40 years working on this, that if I thought that there wasn't a way of alerting people to the problems and dealing with the problems, I would have given up a long time ago. And I haven't found a universal solution. But
mm,
the first failing is that in our school system, we do not teach children about communication and relationship. We don't teach them how to assert themselves.
yes,
And
true.
we don't teach that there are, in fact, predatory people.
Mhm.
And I think they're very easy to recognize. So, in fact, on my website, johnatack.co.uk, there's a little thing you can put on your fridge, which has got the characteristics of predatory people, human predators.
So
And so,
let's take a simple example, probably
mm,
not even uh, the people you're thinking about. Take bullies.
mm, yeah,
Are bullies a potential cult leader, or is it the opposite way around? Somebody who has been bullied. Um, are, is that something we need to pay attention to more? Because you can pick out bullies, obviously, and then maybe head off their worst kind of development after you recognize them.
mm.
Um, I'm not sure that's true about the people who get bullied, but there's too, they could be identified and followed if we wanted to follow them.
And we do run into a problem. The Blair Labour government, roundabout in this country, round about 2002, proposed a scheme whereby all 3 and 4 year olds would be tested using Kent Keel's measures as to whether there's attenuation of the paralimbic system. So whether the prefrontal lobes and the emotional old brain, how
Hmm.
well they're connected. Because Keel's work, having given fMRIs to 500 prison inmates who'd all
Hmm.
demonstrate, he'd gone through the hair psychopathy checklist, revised with them all, and sorted this out. And he reckoned there is this attenuation. And here a government said, oh, we'll just check all the kids. and then we'll watch them through school. And you're going, well, as soon as you start watching them, you've created the category. So there's a problem there. In the initial idea, is it the bullies? To some extent, bullies seem to rise up and become leaders, but in my study, and it's been of a lot of political religious leaders over the millennia, not just over the centuries, there are individuals that we know something about. And there do seem to be certain hallmarks. And people who've been bullied, I would say, are perhaps more likely. Ron Hubbard was certainly bullied as a child.
That's what I
He
was
was,
wondering. Yeah. Okay.
and he was a misfit. People who've been subjected to unpleasant treatment right through his career into the Navy. And I haven't even written about this, but there's actually a journal which I've not been able to authenticate, but it claims to be the journal of somebody who traveled with Hubbard on his first Navy mission, which was to take him to Australia in 1942. And the if this journal is correct, and as I say, I've not been able to verify it, he was bullied by his fellow officers. He had red hair, that picked him out, and there's a point during this voyage where they hold him down and cut his hair.
Oh yeah.
He's violently bullied. He
Yeah.
never says anything about having been the subject of bullying. But I think there are certain things that are very strange about this. And again, one of them, Yuval Laor, when I first met him in 2015, he walked up to me at a conference I was giving in Toronto, all of which is online on this channel. And he put before me the Berfedio list of the traits of temporal lobe epilepsy. And there are 18 traits listed, what used to be called Dostoevsky syndrome. And he said, how many of these did Hubbard have?
Hmm.
Now, I was aware of Berfedio, and I was aware of the trouble they got into in 1977 when they announced their findings and said that St. Paul and Muhammad were both temporal lobe epileptics. And you kind of go, you didn't study your public relations first before making this announcements, did you? We just like to tell you that all the people in your religions were nuts. And there you go. So without making any comment upon St. Paul or Muhammad, and I'm not qualified to do that, Ron Hubbard, 17 out of 18 of these traits I ticked immediately. The 18th one, and of course you only need a majority, the 18th one took me half an hour and I found an example of it. So for example, hypergraphia, can't stop writing. L. Ron Hubbard is listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most prolific author of all time. Couldn't stop writing, tick that one off. Religiosity, this tremendous sense of righteousness, of the certainty, what William James, the great William James, called noesis, where you have feelings of knowing. Story I always tells about the Bible basher who said to me, I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true. And you're going, those are feelings, that's not knowledge. And learning how to separate evidence from what you would like to be true is a fairly important trait of adulthood, of growing up. But in looking at, we've now looked at quite a number of political and religious leaders, and they exhibit signs of temporal lobe epilepsy very specifically.
So if you wanted to try to work on prevention, you might look for kids, young adults who both have been bullied and maybe have these signs of temporal epilepsy. Maybe even a combination is worrisome. I mean, obviously, I'm generalizing, but it's an interesting. His history is an interesting one in that regard.
Yes, and if we stopped practicing sports where people are hit in the head, then there'd be a much lower incidence of temporal lobe epilepsy. If we stopped clipping kids around the ear, there'd be a much lower incidence.
Well, I had 7 concussions as a young adult.
There you go.
I don't
Look
know
what it did to you.
I don't know what it did, but it
turned you into a lovely man, obviously.
I know it caused some damage, but yeah, that's interesting combination you brought up. Makes sense.
And you're just looking at particular individuals. Werner Erhard, the founder of Erhard Seminar Training, the forum landmark, who's still with us, age 90. When he was 5 years old, he fell down a stairwell from 3 flights up and fractured his skull. So you've got absolutely, you'd start worrying that you might get this. And when you read what I mean, I was amazed. I've been talking with a woman called Anne Peterson, who for years worked in this century, worked with the elderly Werner Erhard and experienced his terrible rages, which is
Mm.
something that you do see with such people. And I read her book about it, Is This a Cult? And then I bounced off and read a couple of other books. The official biography, which actually was, people saying, don't read that, it's the official biography. And I'm going, no, I want to see what they think because he approved everything in it. And so the damage to his skull comes from there. But also what he studied to create Est is in there. And it's like he did 2 weeks of Scientology, then 2 weeks of another Scientology form, silver mind control, then 2 weeks of abilitism, another form of Scientology, then 1 week of sudden Zen, this idea that you're going to get enlightened within 5 days. Oh, yeah, really? And he didn't have, this was one of the things that interested me with Hubbard too. They don't, they seem to have some kind of attention deficit. They cannot study things properly.
Also
And
that. Ah.
it's Hare says of sociopaths that they often their grammar doesn't work. I'm not saying anything about Donald Trump's inability to get to the end of a sentence here, by the way. But this is the first thing I noticed about him in 2015. Sort of he changes tense mid-sentence, he stops, repeats something. So this is held to be a characteristic of a mind that is self-defeating. It's working against itself. And with Hubbard, we get that same thing that his expression is curious to say the least,
Mhm.
and his memory of, there's a book that's 90 pages long that took him 2 weeks to write called A History of Man. And in fact, it was Yuval who pulled me up on this because I said, it starts, this is a cold-blooded and factual account of your last 60 trillion years. And and Yuval said, no, 76. I said, no, it says 60. And I went off, got my copy. He went off and got his copy. And my copy, which is close to the original, of course, says 60. His copy, which is the current one, says 76. This is because in the course of 90 pages, a book that took 2 weeks to write, he's gone from 60 to 73 to 76 trillion in the course of the book. And you're going, now that is careless. In a universe that's less than 14 billion years old, he's misplaced 16 trillion years while writing the history of it. That kind of mind that can't maintain facts, that contradicts itself, and that contradiction, I think, is implicit. I Let's get really contentious. Talking with a filmmaker, we're working on a project about Charles Manson and his deep involvement with Scientology. And the guy said, I said something about Winston Churchill. And he said, I've been trying to place a negative documentary about Winston Churchill for 20 years. Nobody's interested. He's such a hero. And then he told me that when Churchill was, I think, 18, he fell off a bridge.
Oh,
And I went and looked it up, and he fell 29 feet onto his head.
wow.
And when you look at his, I've just read John Lukács' 5 Days in May, which is about the 5 day discussion in May 1940. Churchill becomes Prime Minister on the 10th of May. And there are 5 people in the War Cabinet, still including Neville Chamberlain, and they discuss whether or not they ought to talk with Hitler. Now, there are 388,000 troops on the ground in Dunkirk who are about to be annihilated. And these politicians are going, well, should we talk with him or not? And they decide they won't. And you're kind of going, that's really interesting because if it were me, I'd be negotiating. I wouldn't even think about it. I'd be trying to get
Least
stop
try.
those people being strafed and get
Yeah.
them home.
Yeah.
But Churchill went into the meeting and said, whatever happens at Dunkirk, we will fight to the end. And it's sort of, Why? If you can stop it,
Right.
why? And Hitler then, of course, in July offered a walk away because they're saying we won't talk with him because he'll take away all of our our arms and we'll take the empire. And Hitler, his private correspondence is open now, is saying, no, no, the British Empire must persist.
Mm.
So they'd misread him. But one wonders to what extent some mental, psychological predisposition spurs major historical events
Yeah.
and how many of our leaders have actually been nut jobs one way or another
Yeah. No, that's so important, you know,
and
and
still are.
it goes back to what you said about education opportunities in general. You know, education is probably where we could make an impact if we
Mm,
can about leadership, about people turning out to be more sociopathic. Certainly ADD can be caught. Um,
mm.
Temporal lobe epilepsy should be catchable. I mean, all these things in bullying and victims of bullying, all that can be, and we could teach more about mental health in education.
Yes.
So um, I think most of the time we think of looking at parents and how they raise their kids, but maybe equally important is what happens once they get into school and the opportunities to see them in a real social situation and how they're responding. So
Yeah.
all that's quite interesting. I mean, if all of that is true, it's a gigantic challenge to alter some of that for the better. But
Yeah, and I've been very disappointed in 40 years of trying to talk with people. I mean, I have talked at Eton College, I've talked at
yeah,
various universities, but I don't think that what I'm saying is being heard at all.
no,
And the problem is that a lot of the transitions we could make are very simple.
yeah,
That they're about teaching a respect for other people
mhm.
and about teaching the value of compassion rather than saying, oh, we've all got to be empathetic, we've all got to be very nice. Understanding why being compassionate means that there could still be a human race in a million years' time. Whereas
Well, the
not being
strange.
compassionate is going to wipe us out, could wipe us out in a generation.
I have to say something about my field with compassion, which is also a little worrisome. Somebody did a preliminary study about whether psychiatric residents, meaning those in training to become psychiatrists in the United States, are taught compassion or whether compassion is even talked about with them.
Yeah.
And the answer was mainly no.
Mm.
I mean, are you expecting these residents to just automatically be compassionate, which is a bad assumption? And so we don't even do that so well within psychiatry, let
Yeah.
alone in general education that comes before that. And I think that's so important to
Mm.
hone in on. Yeah.
Yeah, I
So,
absolutely agree. And it's about a shift of values that um, one of the most delightful people I've ever met was the Archbishop of Crete. And he would answer to the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church, who in turn would answer to God. So it's a very close connection. I spent 5 hours with this lovely man, and he had a stab at converting me by trying to persuade me that some Muslim had prayed to Jesus and some miracle had happened, and then he realised he wasn't talking to that kind of person. If he could perform a miracle, I'd be quite interested. But hearing about them, I can make stories up too, and have. Um, so he turned to me and he said, "Well, what do you actually believe then?" And he really was. He was this saintly man, just absolutely, Father Irenaeus, absolutely wonderful. And and I said to him, I believe in compassion, and I try to have it. And I know the word means feeling together, compassion, having the same feelings, because I've read Milan Kundera and he writes about it. But I've also looked up the word humility, and I hope one day to have some. And he looked at me and he said, "Humility is the key to everything." And
you said what humility is the key to everything?
yeah, humility is the key to everything. Having humility, because how can we change otherwise unless we can accept our own faults. And
Well, that's good for me to hear. I'm going to be narcissistic and tell you why. So in high school, I was voted most modest.
mm,
Now, the trouble is when I go back to high school reunions, I say, I'm not so modest anymore.
no, you
I wish
swines,
I
you
was.
spoiled it for me. If only you hadn't told me.
I wish I was, because I thought that is a really important characteristic. There's you've probably heard about this, but Moses in the Jewish Bible is viewed as the most humble person around, and yet he was this great leader. And humbleness and great leadership can go hand in hand.
Well, Lao Tzu, and rush out and buy my copy of the Tao Te Ching. Lao Tzu said, with the best leader, the people say, we did it all ourselves. And another text, Think Like a Champion by Donald Trump, where he says, one thing that people don't know about me is how humble I am. And it's true, we don't know that.
Right. Can't seem to find that. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've been going for a great long time, as we always do, and it's always such a pleasure. And I never want to stop, but we're going to have to sooner or later. Uh, we were going to explain how to deal with the situation in Venezuela, but we'll come back to that another
I'll
time.
still be going on by next time. Yeah.
Uh, Unbelievable. So, thanks very much, Steve, and it, anybody who's managed to get this far, this interminable conversation, at least on my part, please comment and like and do that kind of stuff. And tell all your friends that this is the place to be, because you can hear about jazz, you can hear about psychiatry, you can hear about cults, education. It's all happening here.
Jazz to compassion. What could be better? So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And share some food with your neighbors. It's a good plan. Thanks so much, Steve.
Thank you, John.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
I mean, anybody who can spell Massachusetts must have high literacy, let's face it.